Welcome back to Wisdom Unveiled. Just a quick reminder before we jump in, we're working with translations of conversations with Iranian philosophers. So, bear with us if a few things get lost in translation. Today we're on episode 44, which means we're diving deep into the world of Saadi of Shiraz. And he's not just a poet. He's got these incredible insights into human nature, how we connect to something bigger than ourselves.
It's really fascinating, What's interesting is how Saadi uses this really unexpected metaphor to describe that connection. Intoxication. And no, we're not talking about your average Friday night out.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Saadi talks about being intoxicated by the longing I possess. He even says, you with a single sip more could take me beyond myself. It's intense. What kind of longing are we even talking about here?
It's a yearning for the divine,
Yeah.
like a spiritual thirst that can really consume us. In Sufi mysticism, this idea is called fana, the annihilation of the self in the divine. Have you ever felt so drawn to something that it feels like you could lose yourself in it?
Totally. Like when you get lost in a piece of music or like a beautiful sunset. But Saadi takes it a step further, right? He talks about two kinds of wine, mole and tamil.
Exactly. Mole represents those fleeting pleasures, the earthly kind of intoxication. But tamil, that's something else entirely. It represents deep contemplation, the kind that leads to spiritual insight.
So it's like he's saying we need to get drunk on thinking. But isn't that kind of counterintuitive? Don't we usually think of intoxication as something that clouds our judgment?
That's the brilliance of Saadi. He flips the script. He's saying that deep thought, when it's done right, it actually clarifies our vision. It helps us see beyond the surface, to pierce the veil of illusion, so to speak. And this idea of contemplation, it's central to Islamic philosophy. It's not just thinking for the sake of it, but a deliberate path towards knowledge and closeness to God.
And Saadi didn't just sit around contemplating all day, right?
Oh.
He lived a really active life, traveling, teaching, experiencing the world. So how did he find the time for all this deep thinking?
It's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? Finding stillness in our busy lives. But Saadi really believed it was essential. He saw contemplation as a way to integrate spiritual awareness into the everyday, to find that sacred spark within the mundane.
So it's not about escaping reality, but about transforming our experience of it.
Exactly. And the key to that transformation, according to Saadi, lies in recognizing that the divine is already present. We just don't always see it.
So it's not that God is absent. We're just not attuned to that presence. But why? What's blocking us?
Saadi believed we're clouded by these veils. Our ego, our attachments, our worries, even our constant need for entertainment. Think about it. How often are we truly present in the moment? Or are we just constantly seeking distraction, filling the silence with noise?
Oh, that's me to a T. So these veils, they're basically anything that keeps us from that deeper connection.
That's the idea. And the Sufi traditions offer practices like tazkiyah, the purification of the heart, and asana, seeing God in all things, to help us lift those veils and connect with that divine presence.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the connection here. But how do we actually apply this to our lives? Do we need to become Sufi mystics to experience what Saadi is talking about?
Not at all. Remember that story Saadi tells about the holy man with the knee pain?
Oh, yeah.
His friend suggests stretching it out, and the holy man says, I can't. God is present.
Wait, what? He can't stretch because God is present. I don't think I follow.
It's not meant literally. It's about how deeply ingrained the awareness of the divine was in this holy man's life. Every action, even something as mundane as stretching his knee, was infused with that awareness.
So it's like he's found a way to make even the most ordinary moments sacred. But how can we do that when we're juggling a million things, constantly bombarded with distractions?
That's where the concept of muraqabah comes in spiritual watchfulness. It's not about withdrawing from the world, but about cultivating that inner awareness in everything we do. Imagine approaching every interaction, every task, with a sense of sacred presence.
That's a pretty tall order, but I can see how it could be transformative.
It is, and the scholars argue that this transformation isn't just about feeling good. Saadi believed that contemplation could lead to both intellectual and spiritual fulfillment. He even said, a person who is intoxicated by contemplation hits 2 targets with a single arrow.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So it's not just about feeling connected, but gaining knowledge and understanding as well. But isn't it harder to achieve that kind of deep contemplation in our modern world?
Absolutely. One expert even compares the distractions of our modern world to a child's balloon that's been blown up with too much air. It might look impressive for a while, but eventually it's going to burst because it's just not sustainable.
Ouch, that hits close to home. He's basically saying that relying on external stimuli for happiness will ultimately leave us feeling empty.
Precisely. The antidote, these scholars argue, is to cultivate that inner yearning that Saadi describes, that connection with something greater than ourselves.
Okay, but where do we even begin? Saadi doesn't exactly give us a step-by-step guide.
No, he doesn't. But the scholars suggest starting with something very simple, paying attention to the language we use.
Language. What does that have to do with spiritual fulfillment?
They argue that the way we use language can either connect us with deeper truth or distract us from it. One scholar even points to a subtle detail in Saadi's poetry. Remember the line, "I am my own cupbearer, intoxicated by the longing I possess."
Yes, it's so evocative.
The scholar points out that Saadi could have easily said, "I am intoxicated by my longing," but he chose to use the phrase, "I am my own cupbearer." This seemingly small difference actually reveals a profound shift in perspective.
Okay, I'm curious. Break that down for me.
By saying, "I am my own cupbearer," Saadi is emphasizing that the source of his joy, his intoxication, comes from within. He's not relying on anything external to fulfill him.
So it's about taking ownership of our spiritual journey, recognizing that the source of true fulfillment already resides within us.
Exactly. And the scholars suggest we can apply this to our own lives by being more mindful of the language we use. Instead of saying, "I'm looking for happiness," or "I need this to feel complete," try focusing on cultivating that inner joy, that connection with the divine.
So it's about shifting from a place of lack to a place of abundance, recognizing that we already possess the capacity for true fulfillment.
That's the idea. It's about becoming our own cupbearers, pouring ourselves a glass of inner joy.
I love that image. But doesn't it feel like our modern world makes it harder to do that?
Absolutely. One of the biggest obstacles, according to these scholars, is the way we consume information.
Information. What does that have to do with spiritual fulfillment?
They argue that in our constant quest for knowledge, we often lose sight of the wisdom that lies beneath the surface. They draw a comparison to the way we eat. Just as we can eat a lot of food without actually nourishing our bodies, we can consume a lot of information without nourishing our minds or spirits.
It's like stuffing ourselves with empty calories. But instead of junk food, it's junk information.
Exactly. And the scholars argue that this kind of mindless consumption can actually be detrimental to our spiritual growth. They suggest adopting a more contemplative approach to the information we take in.
Okay, so it's not just about how much we consume, but how we process it.
Precisely. It's about slowing down, being more selective about the information we choose to engage with, and taking the time to truly digest it.
So it's not just about reading or listening passively, but actively engaging with the material, asking questions, and reflecting on how it connects to our own lives.
Exactly. And they point to Saadi's work as a model for this contemplative approach. His poetry is full of vivid imagery, metaphors, and stories that invite us to pause, reflect, and connect with deeper truths.
So it's not just about conveying information, but about sparking our imaginations, engaging our emotions, and inviting us to contemplate those deeper meanings.
That's it. And the scholars argue that we can apply the same approach to all the information we consume. Whether we're reading a book, listening to a podcast, or even scrolling through social media, we can ask ourselves, what does this mean to me? How does this connect to my life? What wisdom can I glean from this?
It's about turning information into nourishment for the soul.
Beautifully said. And they emphasize that this transformative process is essential for navigating the complexities of our modern world.
Speaking of complexities, don't you think the sheer volume of information we're exposed to makes it even harder to cultivate this contemplative approach? I mean, how do we even begin to filter through it all?
It's definitely a challenge. One expert argues that information overload can lead to a kind of spiritual paralysis.
Spiritual paralysis. That sounds intense. What do they mean by that?
They explain that when we're constantly bombarded with information, it can be difficult to discern what's truly important, what aligns with our values, and what resonates with our souls. We end up feeling overwhelmed, lost, and disconnected from our own inner compass.
So instead of feeling empowered by information, we end up feeling disempowered, like we're drowning in a sea of data.
Exactly. And the scholars warn that this can lead to spiritual apathy or even despair. But they offer a solution. Cultivating a sense of discernment.
Discernment. What does that look like in practice?
It's about developing the ability to distinguish between what's truly nourishing for our souls and what's simply noise. It's about learning to filter out the distractions and focus on what truly matters.
Okay, but how do we develop this ability to discern? Is it something we're born with or something we can learn?
The scholars believe it's a skill that can be honed, and one of the best ways to do that, they argue, is through contemplation.
There's that word again. But what does it actually mean to be contemplative in a world that's constantly pulling us in different directions?
It's about bringing awareness and intentionality to everything we do. Whether we're reading, having a conversation, or even taking a walk, we can be contemplative by paying attention to our thoughts, feelings, and sensations.
So it's not about withdrawing from the world, but about engaging with it in a more mindful and intentional way.
Exactly. And the scholars emphasize that the more we practice this kind of mindfulness, the stronger our intuition and discernment will become.
So we'll start to recognize those things that truly nourish our souls and those that just add to the noise.
Precisely. And as we cultivate this sense of discernment, we'll be better equipped to navigate the complexities of the modern world without feeling overwhelmed or spiritually paralyzed.
Okay, that makes sense. But sometimes it feels like the modern world is actively working against our efforts to cultivate this kind of contemplative awareness.
I understand that feeling. One scholar points to the culture of instant gratification as a major obstacle to spiritual fulfillment in our modern age.
Instant gratification. How does that impact our spiritual lives?
They argue that this constant desire for immediate results makes it difficult to appreciate the slower, more subtle process of spiritual growth. We want the spiritual equivalent of a microwave meal. But true spiritual transformation is more like a slow-cooked stew. It takes time, patience, and consistent effort.
So it's not about achieving some grand enlightenment overnight, but about engaging in a gradual process of growth and transformation.
Exactly. And the scholars emphasize that this process requires a willingness to be present with discomfort, to embrace the challenges and setbacks as opportunities for learning and growth.
Okay, I see the analogy. But how do we resist the allure of instant gratification? How do we cultivate that patience and perseverance that's so essential for spiritual growth?
The scholars suggest reconnecting with the natural world as a powerful antidote.
Reconnect with nature. How does that help us cultivate patience?
They point out that nature operates on its own timeline. Trees take years to grow, seasons change gradually, and the cycles of life and death unfold with a natural rhythm that's often at odds with our human desire for speed and efficiency.
So by immersing ourselves in nature, we can start to appreciate the beauty of a slower pace, the power of patience, and the wisdom of surrendering to a rhythm that's bigger than our own.
Exactly. And the scholars emphasize that this isn't just about taking a leisurely walk in the park. It's about actively engaging with nature, observing the intricate details, and allowing ourselves to be present with the experience.
So whether we're gardening, hiking, stargazing, or simply sitting under a tree, we can use those experiences as opportunities to cultivate that patience and appreciation for a slower, more deliberate pace of life.
That's the idea. It's about recognizing that true fulfillment, both spiritual and emotional, often unfolds in its own time.
It's about trusting the process, even when it feels slow or uncertain. But isn't that trust hard to come by when we live in a world that's constantly telling us to hurry up, achieve more, and never be satisfied?
It is a challenge. But the scholars believe that one of the most effective ways to counteract this cultural conditioning is to spend more time in silence.
Silence. I can already feel my mind resisting. We live in a world that's constantly bombarding us with noise and stimulation. How can we possibly find silence in this day and age?
It's not easy, that's for sure. But the scholars emphasize that silence isn't about finding a place where there's no sound. It's about creating space for inner stillness, for listening to the whispers of our own hearts.
So it's not about escaping the world, but about finding pockets of peace within it.
Exactly. And they suggest that even a few minutes of intentional silence each day can have a profound impact on our spiritual well-being.
Okay, I'm willing to give it a try, but what do we actually do during those moments of silence? Do we just sit there and try to empty our minds?
That can be one approach, but it's not the only one. The scholars recommend a variety of practices, but one of the simplest and most effective is simply to focus on our breath.
Focus on our breath. How does that help?
They explain that our breath is our constant companion. It's always there, anchoring us to the present moment. By paying attention to our breath, we can cultivate a sense of grounding, of being present with ourselves, even amidst the chaos of daily life.
So it's a way to create a sense of stillness and stability within ourselves, even when the world around us feels chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly. It's a simple practice, but it can be incredibly powerful.
Okay, this is starting to resonate with me. But I have to admit, sometimes it feels like my mind just won't quiet down. What if I can't stop thinking during those moments of silence?
That's a common experience. The scholars emphasize that it's not about forcing our minds to be blank. It's about gently guiding our attention back to our breath whenever we notice our thoughts wandering.
So it's like a mental workout. We're training our minds to be more focused and present.
Exactly. And they point out that just like any muscle, our minds need to be exercised regularly to become stronger.
Okay, this is making a lot of sense, but
Yeah.
I still have one lingering question. What if we're not particularly religious or spiritual? Can we still benefit from these practices of contemplation and silence?
That's a great question. And the scholars' answer is a resounding yes. They emphasize that these practices are about connecting with our own inner wisdom, our own sense of truth, regardless of our religious beliefs or affiliations.
So it's not about subscribing to a specific dogma or belief system, but about cultivating that deep connection with ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. And they point out that this kind of connection is something we all crave, whether we realize it or not.
It's about recognizing that spark of the divine that resides within each of us, regardless of our beliefs or backgrounds.
Beautifully said. And the more we cultivate that connection, the more we'll experience a sense of wholeness, purpose, and fulfillment that transcends any external label or ideology.
This is all really resonating with me. But I have to admit, sometimes it feels like the modern world makes it so difficult to prioritize our spiritual well-being.
It's true. We live in a culture that often values productivity, achievement, and material success above all else.
So how do we resist that cultural conditioning? How do we create space for spiritual growth in a world that's constantly telling us to do more, be more, and have more?
It's a challenge, no doubt. One scholar actually uses a really striking metaphor to describe this struggle.
Ooh, I love a good metaphor. Tell me more.
They compare our modern lives to a hamster wheel, constantly spinning but going nowhere.
Okay, that visual is a little too real. How do we escape that hamster wheel? How do we step off and create a life with more meaning?
They suggest that we need to reconnect with our true nature.
Reconnect with our true nature. Okay, that sounds a little abstract. What does that actually mean?
Imagine peeling away the layers of conditioning, the roles we play, the expectations we try to meet. Beneath all of that is our core essence, our true self. And the scholars argue that our true self is inherently wise, compassionate, and connected to something larger than ourselves.
So it's not about becoming someone new, but about rediscovering who we truly are.
Exactly. And they emphasize that rediscovering our true selves is a journey of self-compassion.
Okay, self-compassion. What does that actually look like?
It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness, care, and understanding we would offer to a loved one who's struggling.
So it's about being gentle with ourselves, forgiving our mistakes, and recognizing that we're all doing the best we can with what we have.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And they believe that self-compassion is essential for creating a safe and supportive inner environment where we can truly thrive.
It makes sense, but self-compassion can be tough, especially when we're used to being so critical of ourselves. How do we cultivate it when it feels so unfamiliar?
It definitely takes effort. One simple technique the scholars recommend is to pay attention to our self-talk.
So become aware of those negative judgments that pop up in our minds.
Exactly. And when you notice those negative thoughts, try to reframe them with compassion. For example, instead of saying, "I'm so stupid," try saying, "I'm learning." Or instead of, "I'm such a failure," try, "I'm doing the best I can."
It's like we're practicing being a good friend to ourselves.
That's a great way to think about it. The more we practice compassionate self-talk, the more natural it will become.
It's like we're creating a loving and nurturing space within ourselves where our true selves can flourish.
Beautifully said. The scholars emphasize that self-compassion is essential for reconnecting with our true nature and building a more fulfilling life.
This is all really making sense, but I have to be honest. Our culture often celebrates perfectionism and achievement, which feels like the opposite of self-compassion.
It's true. Our culture often sends the message that we're not enough unless we're constantly striving for more.
So how do we cultivate self-compassion in a world that's constantly telling us we need to be better, thinner, richer, more successful?
It's definitely a challenge. One scholar suggests that cultivating a sense of connection can help us resist that pull.
Connection. What kind of connection?
They explain that we're inherently social creatures, wired for connection with others and with something larger than ourselves.
So it's about nurturing relationships that make us feel seen, heard, and supported.
Exactly. These connections can provide us with a sense of belonging, purpose, and meaning that goes beyond fleeting external validation.
That makes sense. But how do we cultivate these connections when our world often feels isolating and disconnected?
The scholars highlight the importance of vulnerability in building authentic connections.
Being vulnerable can feel risky. Why is it so important?
When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with others, to share our authentic selves, our imperfections and struggles, we create the space for genuine intimacy.
So it's about letting down our guard, taking off the masks, and letting people see the real us, flaws and all.
Exactly. And the scholars point out that this vulnerability is incredibly powerful, both for ourselves and for the people we connect with.
Okay, I see the value in that. But vulnerability can be scary. How do we begin to practice it? Where do we start?
They suggest starting small. It could be as simple as sharing a personal story with a trusted friend, expressing your feelings to a loved one, or asking for help when you need it.
So baby steps. Gradually stretching our comfort zone and becoming more open and authentic in our interactions.
That's it. The more we practice vulnerability, the more comfortable we'll become with it, and the deeper our connections will be.
That makes sense. But our culture often values strength, independence, and putting on a brave face, all things that seem to contradict vulnerability.
It's true. Our culture often tells us to toughen up and hide our weaknesses.
So how do we cultivate vulnerability in a world that tells us to do the opposite?
One scholar suggests that embracing our imperfections can help us overcome that conditioning.
Embracing our imperfections. Why is that important for vulnerability?
When we embrace our imperfections, when we accept ourselves for who we are, flaws and all, we create a foundation of self-love that makes it easier to be open and vulnerable with others.
It's about recognizing that our flaws aren't something to be ashamed of, but rather a part of what makes us unique.
Exactly. And when we embrace our imperfections, we give other people permission to do the same.
So we're creating a space of acceptance and authenticity, where everyone feels safe to be themselves without judgment.
That's beautifully said. And they emphasize that this type of authentic connection is crucial for our well-being.
This is really resonating with me. But honestly, embracing our imperfections in a world obsessed with perfection feels like swimming upstream.
It's definitely a challenge. We're constantly bombarded with images of unattainable perfection, which makes us feel insecure. But one scholar suggests cultivating a sense of humor as a way to combat this.
Humor. That's an interesting take. How does humor help us embrace our imperfections?
They explain that when we can laugh at ourselves, at the absurdity of our flaws and mistakes, we take away their power.
So it's about not taking ourselves too seriously, finding the lightheartedness in our imperfections, and recognizing that we're all just human, doing the best we can.
Exactly. Humor can be a powerful antidote to perfectionism and self-criticism. It's like we're giving ourselves permission to be perfectly imperfect.
I love that. Takes the pressure off, right? We can be worthy of love and acceptance without needing to be perfect.
Precisely. And the scholars emphasize that this playful self-acceptance can be incredibly freeing.
Okay, I'm on board with this idea, but how do we actually find humor in our imperfections? It's not always easy to laugh at ourselves, especially when we're feeling insecure.
It definitely takes practice, but there are a few things we can do. One technique the scholars recommend is to simply start noticing the humor in everyday situations.
So being more attuned to those funny moments that life throws our way. But how does that help us laugh at ourselves?
They explain that when we start to see humor in the world around us, it becomes easier to see it in ourselves.
So we're training our minds to look for the lighter side of things, even when things aren't going our way.
Exactly. And they point out that this perspective can make it much easier to embrace our imperfections.
It's like we're choosing to see the funny side of our humanness instead of getting bogged down by the pressure to be perfect.
Exactly. And they argue that this shift in perspective can be incredibly liberating.
I love that. It feels like we're giving ourselves permission to just be ourselves, flaws and all.
That's exactly it. And they believe that this kind of self-acceptance is essential for fostering vulnerability and building authentic connections with others.
This is really resonating with me. But sometimes it feels like our world is so serious that it's tough to find that sense of humor.
It's true. We often get caught up in the seriousness of work, responsibilities, and world events. It's easy to forget the importance of joy and lightheartedness.
So how do we cultivate humor when the world around us feels so serious?
One scholar suggests reconnecting with our inner child as a way to tap into that playful energy.
Reconnect with our inner child. Now that sounds like fun, but how does that help us cultivate humor?
Think about it. Children are naturally playful, curious, and full of wonder. They see the world through a lens of imagination and possibility, and they're not afraid to laugh at themselves or make mistakes.
So it's about tapping into that playful energy, that lightheartedness that we often lose as we get older.
Exactly. Reconnecting with our inner child can help us rediscover the joy and humor in everyday life.
It's like giving ourselves permission to be silly, to let go of inhibitions, and to approach life with a sense of playfulness and possibility.
Beautifully said. And the scholars argue that this kind of playfulness can be incredibly transformative.
This is really resonating with me. But honestly, it feels like it's been ages since I've truly connected with that playful, childlike part of myself.
It can feel that way, but they assure us that our inner child is always there waiting to be rediscovered.
So how do we awaken that playful spirit?
They suggest a simple but powerful solution. Make time for play.
Play as adults. Isn't that a bit frivolous?
They emphasize that play is essential for our well-being. It helps us relax, de-stress, and connect with our creativity and joy.
So it's not about being childish or irresponsible, but about making time for activities that bring us joy and allow us to express ourselves freely.
That's it. And they point out that play can take many forms. It could be dancing, singing, playing games, spending time in nature, pursuing creative hobbies, or just having a good laugh with friends.
It's about doing those things that make us feel alive, those things that spark our curiosity and ignite our imaginations.
Beautifully said. And they emphasize that the more we make time for play, the easier it will be to embrace our imperfections and cultivate a sense of humor about ourselves. This is really inspiring. It's like we're giving ourselves permission to approach life with more lightheartedness and to not take ourselves too seriously. But I have to admit, it's tough to find that playfulness when the world around us feels so serious.
It's true. Our culture often prioritizes busyness, productivity, and achievement. It can be difficult to create space for spontaneity, creativity, and the simple pleasures of play.
So how do we rediscover that sense of play in a world that's constantly telling us to grow up and get serious?
Right, exactly.
One scholar suggests that cultivating a sense of wonder can help us overcome that cultural conditioning.
Wonder. It's beautiful. How does wonder help us reconnect with our inner child?
They explain that wonder is about approaching the world with curiosity, awe, and appreciation. It's about seeing the world through fresh eyes, as if for the first time, and letting ourselves be amazed by the beauty and mystery that surround us.
It's like we're rediscovering that sense of childlike amazement and curiosity that we often lose touch with as we get older.
That's a great way to put it. The scholars emphasize that the sense of wonder is always there, waiting to be rekindled.
I love that idea. But how do we rekindle that sense of wonder? How do we begin to see the world through those fresh eyes again?
One powerful way to do that is to make time for exploration.
Exploration? What kind of exploration?
They encourage us to try new things, to step outside our comfort zones, and to approach the world with a sense of openness and curiosity. It could be traveling to a new place, taking up a new hobby, or even just taking a different route to work.
It's about breaking out of our routines, challenging our assumptions, and allowing ourselves to be surprised by the world.
Exactly. It's about reawakening that sense of adventure and discovery.
I love that. So the more we explore, the more we can rediscover that sense of wonder.
Precisely. And that sense of wonder is essential for reconnecting with our inner child and cultivating a sense of humor about ourselves.
This makes a lot of sense. But honestly, it often feels like our world is designed to squash that sense of wonder.
You're right. Our culture tends to emphasize control, predictability, and the familiar. It can be difficult to hold space for the unexpected, the mysterious, or the awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
So how do we cultivate awe in a world that's constantly trying to limit our sense of possibility?
Yeah, how do we do that?
One scholar suggests a surprising approach: cultivating gratitude.
Gratitude. We've talked about that before, but how does it connect to awe?
They explain that when we focus on what we're grateful for, we naturally shift our attention away from what we lack and toward the abundance that already surrounds us.
So it's about appreciating the good things in our lives, both big and small.
Exactly. And they believe that the shift in perspective can open us up to experiencing awe.
It's like we're inviting the possibility of wonder and amazement simply by appreciating the beauty and goodness that already exists.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And they emphasize that the more we cultivate gratitude, the more likely we are to experience awe in our everyday lives.
That makes sense. But gratitude can be a difficult practice to maintain. How do we cultivate it, especially when life gets busy and stressful?
It definitely takes effort. But one simple and effective technique is to keep a gratitude journal.
Can you remind me what a gratitude journal is?
It's simple, really. Take a few minutes each day to write down things you're grateful for. It can be anything, from big things like your health and loved ones, to smaller things like a beautiful sunset or a delicious meal.
So we're training our minds to notice, and appreciate the good things in our lives, even when things feel tough.
Exactly. And they emphasize that the more we practice gratitude, the more it will become a natural part of how we experience the world.
It's like we're retraining our brains to focus on the positive.
That's a great way to put it, and this shift in perspective can have a ripple effect on all areas of our lives.
So the more grateful we are, the happier and more fulfilled we become. And the less we feel pressured to chase external validation.
Exactly. It's an upward spiral. And they emphasize that gratitude is a key ingredient in cultivating a sense of awe and wonder that can help us reconnect with that childlike joy and bring a sense of lightness and playfulness back into our lives.
This has been such a fascinating journey through Saadi's ideas. It's amazing how his insights from centuries ago can still feel so relevant and insightful today.
It is. Saadi had such a profound understanding of human nature. His insights are truly timeless.
It's like he tapped into something universal about the human experience.
Exactly. And the scholars we've been discussing emphasize that this exploration, this seeking for connection with the divine, is not about adhering to strict doctrines or rituals. It's about nurturing a deep, personal relationship with whatever you consider sacred.
It's about finding our own unique path.
Beautifully put. And they remind us that this path can take many forms. It could be through traditional religious practices, connecting with the divine in nature, through art or music, or simply through quiet contemplation and self-reflection. The key is that it resonates with you.
So it's about honoring our individual journey and trusting that we're being guided in the right direction.
Exactly. They stress the importance of approaching this journey with openness, embracing the unknown, and trusting that we're being supported every step of the way.
This has been such a rich and thought-provoking exploration of Saadi's work. As we wrap up, what's the most important message our listeners can take away from this deep dive?
I think the core message is this. Spiritual fulfillment isn't about reaching some far-off destination or rigidly adhering to rules. It's about nurturing a deep sense of connection with ourselves, with the world around us, and with whatever we hold sacred.
It's about embracing the journey and trusting the process.
That's beautifully said. And as Saadi reminds us, this journey can be an incredibly joyful and enriching one. It can be intoxicating, filled with wonder, and a sense of profound connection.
So, to our listeners, as you move through your day, we invite you to consider this. What are some small steps you can take to cultivate that inner longing, that connection with something greater than yourself? Maybe it's creating space for silence in your day, practicing gratitude for the simple blessings in your life, or immersing yourself in nature and allowing yourself to be filled with awe. Whatever path you choose, we wish you a journey overflowing with joy, wonder, and the intoxicating discovery of your own unique truths. Until next time, keep seeking.